illuminates this week's Parsha. And then I looked a little further. Did you know that this is called Black Sabbath among Jews? This is the darkest, the absolute darkest, worse than Yom Kippur. As you mentioned, Isaiah, the prophet, portends doom and gloom if we don't stop sinning. And then there's Tisha B'Av, which is coming up, which is basically worse than Yom Kippur because there's no redemption. It's only focusing on death and destruction among us. And then I started thinking about it and I thought, wait a minute, Charlotte can relate to this. This is quite natural for me. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor. Tisha B'Av was every day in my home growing up. No, I don't mean my mother talked about it. She never talked about it. You know, she was one of those totally quiet survivors. But that's the thing about secrets, you know, they kind of tumble out anyway accidentally. And ours definitely did, particularly at the Jewish holidays, like Yom Kippur, when the upright piano in the corner of the living room was covered in so many Yortzeit memorial candles, one for every member that had died, that the glow was blinding. Or Hanukkah, I remember she put this gorgeous silver menorah in the window, lit with a rainbow of luminous candles, facing Virginia Avenue in Clifton, and then she would quickly pull the shades down so nobody would know we were Jewish. Thanksgiving, that was a good one. Mr. Glassman, a survivor from down the road, would come over every year to spend the holiday with us. He had stolen a fork out of a Nazi kitchen when he was there. It was heavy and silver with a swastika engraved in the handle. And he only used it once a year at Thanksgiving to carve the turkey. Eat! You know, Tisha B'Av was in our home every day, but it wasn't obvious. It was nuanced. It was in our food. You know, like we had enough food to feed a small country, 3 refrigerators. One night I was so hungry, I went into the freezer and about 400 frozen chickens came out and fell on my toes. And as I was putting them back, I saw that one had been there so long it was green and moldy on the inside, so I threw it out. My mother almost had a heart attack. It turns out it was a roll of $200 she hid inside the head of the chicken. You never know, it can all be taken away. And my father admitted he'd been finding rolls of cash hidden everywhere for years. Tisha B'Av was in our names. My Hebrew name is Rachel. It's an international name given to me, so in case I ever have to flee the country, it's easily translatable. Growing up, I was told to be a doctor. That way I'd have a skill I could use anywhere if I had to escape. But my American name is Lisa, an all-American baby boom name, right? You know, like the kind of name you'd find on a plastic pen in Walmart. Whenever I was in school, whatever grade I was in, whenever the teacher called my name, at least 6 kids screamed, "Here!" You know, I felt lucky about that because all the other children of survivors I went to Hebrew school with were named after relatives that had died in the camps. Like there was a kid named Shmuli and Moishi and Bitsy and Mitzi, and I didn't have that problem. You know, my name was Lisa, and Lisa was anonymous, and anonymous was good, you know. We only made donations anonymously in my family. We weren't allowed to put bumper stickers on our car. Nobody could know our political affiliations. When my family bought their house from an Irish family over 65 years ago, they never changed the front doormat. Until the day they sold it, it read Maloney. Look, I do a little gardening, although I'm not very good at it, but I think I know a few things. I think I know that a plant needs roots if it's gonna grow, if it's gonna flourish and become a thing of beauty. But as far as I knew, my mother had no roots. Or if she did, that part of her past was so dark, I wasn't allowed to know about it. She never talked about it. In my mind, she was like a tree that you saw off in the middle, stick into the ground somewhere else and hope that it grows upright, you know? Through and through, my mother was Holocaust. My mother was Tisha B'Av. My father, on the other hand, was pogrom. The difference between them was time. His family came over after the pogroms in Poland, and they had plenty of time to take the roots and stick them into the ground in the Lower East Side and eventually in Brooklyn and hold on for dear life. And that's what they did. And so my father had a relatively happy childhood, you know? He used to play Brooklyn games. Did anybody play Brooklyn games here? Like stickball and stoop ball and Johnny on the Pony, I Declare War, Ring Olivia, right? At exactly the same moment, it occurred to me that my mother was marching in the snow at gunpoint. My father was marching across Eastern Parkway into the botanical gardens and playing wonderful games with his sister. At exactly the same moment that my mother was scrounging around for every morsel of food to keep herself alive, my father was sitting at the soda fountain drinking egg creams and eating Charlotte Russe. So of course, to my father, the world was a wonderful place, but of course, to my mother, his perspective was crazy. She used to say, your father, that whole side of the Lipkin family, that crazy. I said, what, man, your family wasn't? She said, yes, but in a normal way. I mean, she had a point. His family was a little crazy. He had an Aunt Gertie who drove across the country chasing Tom Jones in a van, throwing her polyester housecoat at him. And he had a cousin, Danny, who was a physicist who absolutely disagreed with Einstein until the day he died. His license plate on his car said E does not equal MC squared. But the few times I was about to meet the Lipkins, they were really nice to me, you know. And I told my mother that, but you know, she didn't care. She didn't care at all. But, you know, I said to her, look, I said, I think the Lipkins are just super, super nice. And they're very, very unjudgmental. And I like that about them. She said, that's because they're simple. Simple people don't judge. Yeah, I never understood why she resented his side of the family so. Maybe it was because they were from a different class than she was. Maybe it was because of their roots, which anchored them in the American soil. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because his parents were alive and hers weren't. But I'll never forget the day we went to clean out my grandfather Lipkin's apartment when he died. And the interesting thing is, he died 5 years after my grandmother Lipkin on exactly the same day, exactly. I thought this was mystical and odd. I couldn't understand why, but my mother said, it's obvious why. They didn't want you to have to make 2 trips to the cemetery. So we started with something you'll all be familiar with. Some of you who are of my age, the sofa covered in clear plastic slipcover. Then we moved to this TV that had these rabbit air, remember the antennae? And we picked this huge Zenith television setup and moved it. And then there was this box of junk in the middle of the room, and it was just filled with bric-a-brac, but there was a jewelry box at the bottom. So I lifted it up and opened it up, and it was magical to me. It was filled with sparkling rhinestone jewelry, a roller skate key, a Timex watch, and something caught my father's eye. And his hand plunged down, and he picked it up, and he handed it to me. He said, I want you to have this. It was a cameo pin. And I'll never forget the face of the woman on that pin. She had like alabaster skin and carved hair on the top of her head with one piece that fell down. And I think I must have looked absolutely elated because I remember my mother saying, look at the face on that child. She's walking on the 9th cloud. I said, Ma, I'm excited. Don't make a scenery. And I watched my father try to reminisce, but I think it must have been too painful for my mother because she said, look at that junk, so low class. I'm getting sick. I'm gonna throw up. Take me home. So I watched my father struggle between trying to attend to his memories of his own mother and trying to take care of my mother, which of course in the end he always did. But I didn't mind. See, I now finally had roots in the form of a pin. Something that finally connected me to something in my past. For my mother, I had no objects, I had no stories, I had absolutely nothing. And I took that pin. Charlotte was in high school with me, maybe you don't know this, but I wore it everywhere. I wore it to gym class. I wore it down the hall to the library. I wore it in my science class. At night, in the winter, I would put it on my winter coat and I would pin it on. It was amazing. I finally had a past. And that winter, though, I decided to do what I always did. I was playing Witch of the Neighborhood on Virginia Avenue, and there was a gutter that ran across our street. And I was stirring the stream like a cauldron, playing the witch, and all the kids were gathered around me, and I went, yeah! And I think the pressure on the pin must have been too much because it took a suicidal leap. and it got sucked under by the gutter. And I tried to reach for it, my hands almost froze, and it was gone. And I started to cry, such an intense cry, like so beyond my years that my eyes blew up like lobsters. And I somehow knew I couldn't tell my mother because I thought she'd say to me something like, "Nothing lasts forever, darling." And I thought my father had tears he hadn't shed yet, and I didn't want to be the one to make them flow. So I didn't say a word. I took my coat off, I put it on my arm, and I ran into my room, and I sat on my bed, and I said a prayer to God, who was still the guy in the sky for me back then. I said, I won't torture my brother so much. I will clean my room. I'll be good if you just send me my roots back to me. Now, months went by, months, and it was the spring. And once again, I took my rightful place as the witch of the neighborhood, and I started stirring the cauldron with all the kids gathered around me, and I went, and there it was, the pin, stuck on a soggy twig sticking straight up. It was like a muddy survivor. It was a quiet flag. And I grabbed the pin, I had a tissue in my pocket, I grabbed it, I put it in, I didn't say a word to any of my friends, not a word. I just ran in the house, I ran upstairs, I threw it in my jewelry box, and I closed the lid. And it was at that moment I knew that miracles happen. That every so often roots took hold, that trees are reborn, and that pins travel far, but they return. Just why was that pin so important to me? I've thought about it and thought about it for years. And I think as we usher in Tisha B'Av, I finally have an answer. I think it's part of the difference between floating and going down. Good Shabbos, everyone. Thank you.